Blood-red sunlight spilled across the Pennsylvania countryside on the evening of June 30th, 1863, casting long shadows that seemed to foretell the darkness about to engulf the sleepy town of Gettysburg. For most residents, it was simply another summer day drawing to a close, but history's machinery was already in motion, grinding inexorably toward what would become the most pivotal battle of the American Civil War. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia moved east of the mountains, swelling with confidence after their victory at Chancellorsville. The Confederate forces had pushed north into Union territory, a bold gambit designed to bring the war to Northern soil, to force a decisive battle that might finally break the will of the Union and secure foreign recognition for the Confederate cause. Lee understood that Southern independence would require not just military victories, but diplomatic recognition, writes historian James McPherson in Battle Cry of Freedom. A major victory on Northern soil might tip the scales of European opinion in favor of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, General George Gordon Meade, had been in command for just 3 days. Inheriting an army still reeling from previous defeats, Meade faced the monumental task of intercepting Lee's forces while protecting Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia from Confederate attack. What neither general fully appreciated was that their armies were being drawn toward each other by circumstances beyond their control. Confederate General Henry Heth's division was marching toward Gettysburg, having heard rumors of a supply of shoes in the town, a precious commodity for an army whose soldiers were often reduced to marching barefoot. Union cavalry under General John Buford had already arrived, recognizing the strategic importance of the high ground around the town. As darkness fell on that final night of June, individual soldiers on both sides wrote letters home, cleaned their weapons, and tried to sleep under the vast Pennsylvania sky. Some sensed the coming storm. Others remained blissfully unaware that they were about to participate in what would become the defining battle of American history. Among them was Private William Davison of the 24th Michigan Infantry, who wrote in his diary, "We have marched without rest for days now. The boys are tired but in good spirits. There's talk of the Rebs nearby. Tomorrow may bring us face to face with the enemy at last." His words, preserved in the archives of the Michigan Historical Society, capture the strange mixture of exhaustion, anticipation, and dread that hung over the Union camps. In the Confederate camp, similar sentiments prevailed. Lieutenant William Peel of the 11th Mississippi wrote to his wife, "We are deep in Pennsylvania now, my dear. The local folks watch us with fear in their eyes as we pass. They have only known this war through newspaper accounts until now. Soon, they will know it as we do, intimately and terribly." As stars wheeled overhead, neither army fully understood that they stood on the threshold of a confrontation that would transcend military significance. Gettysburg would become more than a battle of armies. It would evolve into a crucible testing the very soul of a divided nation. The rolling hills, farm fields, and rocky outcrops around the town would soon become immortalized as hallowed ground. Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard. Ordinary geographical features about to be transformed into legendary landscapes of sacrifice and courage. In town, civilians sensed the coming storm. Julia Weichert, whose farm lay near what would soon become a battleground, noted in her journal, "There is a stillness tonight that feels unnatural. The soldiers passing through speak of more coming. I fear that our peaceful town will soon know war's terrible embrace." That night, as thousands of men slept under the Pennsylvania sky, the fate of the American experiment hung in the balance. The next 3 days would determine whether the United States would continue as one nation or permanently divide into 2 separate countries with fundamentally different visions of liberty and human rights. The morning of July 1st, 1863 broke hot and humid over Gettysburg. The stillness shattered at daybreak when Union cavalry pickets spotted Confederate infantry advancing along the Chambersburg Pike. General John Buford's cavalrymen, though outnumbered, had taken positions on McPherson's Ridge west of town, determined to delay the Confederate advance until Union infantry could arrive. "Hold the high ground at all costs," Buford ordered his men, recognizing that the fate of the coming battle might well depend on who controlled the ridges around Gettysburg. By 9 o'clock, The sharp crack of carbines echoed through the morning air as dismounted Union cavalry engaged General Henry Heth's approaching division. What began as a chance encounter rapidly escalated. Confederate forces pushed forward, believing they faced only militia, not realizing they had engaged elements of the Army of the Potomac. When Union General John Reynolds arrived with the First Corps, he immediately grasped the tactical importance of the ground. "We will fight them here," he declared, moments before a Confederate bullet struck him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. According to the official records of the War of the Rebellion, compiled by the U.S. War Department, Reynolds's death marked a critical moment. The fall of this gallant officer at this critical time was an irreparable loss to the Army of the Potomac. By mid-morning, a full-scale battle was underway. Union forces formed a defensive line from McPherson's Ridge to Seminary Ridge, desperately trying to slow the Confederate onslaught. The Iron Brigade, composed of Midwestern regiments known for their fierce fighting, made a heroic stand in McPherson's Woods, suffering catastrophic casualties but buying precious time for more Union troops to arrive. As noon approached, Confederate General Robert Rodes' division struck the Union right flank from Oak Hill, threatening to collapse the entire Union line. Simultaneously, General William Dorsey Pender's division joined the attack from the west. Caught in a deadly crossfire, Union forces began a fighting withdrawal through the town itself. The retreat through Gettysburg streets became chaotic. Union soldiers fought house to house, using buildings as cover. Many were captured in the narrow streets, unable to escape the converging Confederate forces. Those who could escape reformed on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill south of town, high ground that would prove decisive in the coming days. By late afternoon, the Union situation appeared dire. However, the arrival of General Winfield Scott Hancock changed the dynamic. Though outranked by some officers already present, Hancock's commanding presence restored order. Hancock rode among the troops, his tall figure dominant, his confident manner infectious, wrote historian Bruce Catton in Glory Road. Men who had felt beaten began to feel unbeaten again. As evening approached, both armies took stock of their positions. Lee arrived on the battlefield and surveyed the situation from Seminary Ridge. He had won the day, pushing Union forces out of Gettysburg, but the enemy now held the high ground south of town. Without his cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, who was still absent on a controversial raid, Lee lacked critical intelligence about Union strength and positions. Lee turned to General Richard Ewell, who had replaced the legendary Stonewall Jackson after his death at Chancellorsville, and suggested an attack on Culp's Hill. "If practicable, I want you to carry that hill." Ewell, more cautious than Jackson, decided against a twilight assault, a decision that would be debated by historians for generations afterward. As darkness fell, the survivors of the day's fighting collapsed in exhaustion. The fields around Gettysburg were strewn with the dead and wounded. Civilians in the town tended to the injured who had been left behind in the Union retreat, transforming their homes into makeshift hospitals. Throughout the night, both armies received reinforcements. General George Meade arrived near midnight, immediately studying the terrain by moonlight and approving the defensive position his subordinates had established. He arranged his forces in a fishhook-shaped line along Cemetery Ridge, curving around to Culp's Hill, a naturally strong defensive position. Among the soldiers settling into position that night was Sergeant Frederick Fugger of Battery A, 4th, U.S. Artillery. In his later account published in the Gettysburg papers, he wrote, "We knew as we positioned our guns on Cemetery Ridge that the next day would bring a terrible fight. The men spoke little, each wrapped in his own thoughts, perhaps wondering if he would see another sunset. The strategic stakes had never been higher. For Lee, a decisive victory on Northern soil might force the Lincoln administration to negotiate peace. For Meade and the Union, defeat could mean the fall of Washington and the end of the American experiment in democracy. Both sides knew that the coming day would prove crucial, not just to this battle, but to the entire trajectory of the Civil War. By noon on July 2, 1863, the full armies of both North and South had arrived at Gettysburg. The Union forces formed a defensive line resembling a fishhook, running from Culp's Hill through Cemetery Hill and along Cemetery Ridge to the Round Tops in the south. The Confederates held Seminary Ridge to the west, with their lines stretching north around the town and southeast toward the Union left flank. General Robert E. Lee, confident after the previous day's success, planned an assault against both flanks of the Union line. Lieutenant General James Longstreet would lead the main attack against the Union left, while Lieutenant General Richard Ewell would demonstrate against Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill to prevent reinforcements from shifting south. Longstreet, however, had misgivings about the plan. "General," he reportedly told Lee, "I have been a soldier all my life. I have seen the carnage of frontal assaults. The enemy holds commanding ground. We should maneuver around their flank rather than attack directly." Lee, determined to press his advantage, insisted, "The enemy is there and I am going to strike him." This exchange, documented in Longstreet's memoirs, From Manassas to Appomattox, highlighted the strategic disagreement that would shape the day's fighting. The assault began later than planned. Longstreet's corps had to countermarch to avoid being spotted by Union signal officers on Little Round Top, delaying the attack until 4 in the afternoon. When it finally came, the Confederate onslaught struck with terrible force along the E.O. Emmitsburg Road, hitting Union positions at the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den. General Daniel Sickles had made a fateful decision that morning, moving his Third Corps forward from Cemetery Ridge to slightly higher ground along the Emmitsburg Road without Meade's approval. This created a salient in the Union line, a bulge that could be attacked from multiple sides. Sickles' unauthorized advance created a crisis that nearly lost the battle, wrote historian Edwin Coddington in the Gettysburg campaign. The Confederate attack smashed into this vulnerable position, and despite heroic resistance, the Third Corps began to crumble under relentless pressure. As the battle raged in the Peach Orchard and Wheat Field, Union General Gouverneur Warren made a discovery that would alter the course of American history. From his vantage point on Little Round Top, he noticed that this crucial hill on the extreme left of the Union line was virtually undefended, even as Confederate forces moved to seize it. Capturing this hill would allow the Confederates to enfilade the entire Union line with artillery fire, potentially forcing a retreat. In one of the war's most fortuitous moments, the Fifth Corps was marching nearby toward a different position when Warren intercepted them. Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade, including the 20th Maine Infantry commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, double-timed to the summit just minutes before Confederate forces from Alabama and Texas began their assault. What followed was one of the most dramatic stands of the Civil War. The 20th Maine held the extreme left of the entire Union Army, the end of the line. If they broke, the Confederate forces could roll up the Union position from the flank. After withstanding repeated assaults and running critically low on ammunition, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge down the hillside. "We had one bullet per man when I gave the order to fix bayonets," Chamberlain later wrote in his official report. "It was imperative to strike before we were struck." The 20th Maine's charge swept down the hillside, surprising the exhausted Confederates and securing Little Round Top for the Union. Elsewhere along the line, similar dramas unfolded. At the Wheat Field, possession changed hands 6 times in savage fighting. The Irish Brigade suffered appalling casualties defending the center. At Devil's Den, Confederate sharpshooters took positions among the boulders, picking off Union artillery crews on Little Round Top until Union sharpshooters managed to suppress their fire. By dusk, the Union left had bent but not broken. Sickles was carried from the field with his leg shattered by a cannonball. It would later be amputated and, in one of the war's more macabre footnotes, he would donate it to the Army Medical Museum, where he reportedly visited it annually on the battle's anniversary. On the Union right, Ewell's attacks began as evening approached, striking Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. After initial success, the Confederate attack stalled as darkness fell. Union General George Slocum reinforced the position through the night, ensuring that the fishhook remained intact despite the day's desperate fighting. As the smoke cleared on the second day, both armies had suffered grievous losses. The ground, from Devil's Den through the Wheat Field to the Peach Orchard, was littered with thousands of dead and wounded. The moans of the injured carried through the summer night as stretcher-bearers worked by lantern light. Looking across the valley toward the Union position, Lee remained confident despite the day's missed opportunities. "We will strike them in the center tomorrow," he told his generals. "We've tested both flanks. The center must give way." Dawn broke over Gettysburg on July 3, 1863, revealing a landscape transformed by war. The once peaceful Pennsylvania farmland was now scarred with shell holes, trampled crops, and the detritus of battle. Most horrifying were the thousands of bodies scattered across the fields and hillsides, bearing silent testimony to the previous 2 days' carnage. Fighting resumed at first light on Culp's Hill, where Confederate forces had gained a foothold the previous evening. For 7 hours, a savage contest raged as Union troops methodically reclaimed the ground. By 11 o'clock, the Union right flank was secure, and an ominous quiet descended over the battlefield. In the Confederate camp, General Robert E. Lee finalized his plan for a massive assault against the Union center. Despite the previous day's failures to turn either flank, Lee believed the Union line must be weakened from those efforts. "The enemy is there," he reportedly said, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to strike him." Lieutenant General James Longstreet, tasked with commanding the assault, made a final attempt to dissuade Lee. According to Longstreet's post-war writings, he told his commander, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee was unmoved, and preparations continued. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after an eerie 2-hour silence, the largest artillery bombardment of the war commenced. Over 150 Confederate cannon opened fire on the Union center, sending shells screaming across the 3/4 mile of open field separating the armies. Union artillery responded, and for nearly 2 hours, the hills around Gettysburg echoed with an apocalyptic thunder. The Washington Evening Star later reported, "Veterans of the Peninsula Campaign and Antietam declared they had never witnessed artillery fire of such intensity. The very ground seemed to heave and shudder under its force." Union General Henry Hunt wisely ordered his artillery to gradually reduce their fire, creating the impression that the Confederate bombardment had been effective in silencing the Union guns. It was a strategic deception that would have deadly consequences for the attacking Confederates. Around 3 o'clock, the Confederate cannonade slackened, and approximately 12,000 Southern soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge. Formed in magnificent battle lines nearly a mile wide, they began the long march across open ground toward the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. At their center marched the fresh division of Major General George Pickett, flanked by divisions under Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew and Major General Isaac Trimble. From the Union position, the sight was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Union artillery, which had conserved ammunition during the bombardment, now opened with devastating effect. Solid shot tore holes in the Confederate lines, while canister fire, essentially turning cannon into giant shotguns, scythed down entire ranks. Despite appalling casualties, the Confederate troops closed ranks and continued forward. As they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, Union infantry rose from behind their stone wall and added their fire to the maelstrom. The Confederate assault, already shredded by artillery, began to disintegrate under this combined firepower. Yet a determined group of Virginians under Brigadier General Lewis Armistead managed to breach the Union line at a jog in the stone wall known as the Angle. Armistead, his hat raised high on his sword as a guide for his men, leaped the wall and briefly laid his hand on a Union cannon before falling mortally wounded. For a few desperate minutes, hand-to-hand combat raged around the Union guns. Union reserves rushed to seal the breach, and the Confederate breakthrough, unsupported and isolated, was gradually crushed. Survivors began the long walk back across the killing ground they had just crossed. Captain Frank Haskell of the Union Army, who witnessed the repulse of the charge, later wrote in his memoir, "The rebellion had exhaled half its breath in this terrible effort. When the last Confederate had either fallen, surrendered, or retreated, we knew in our hearts that the Confederate cause itself had reached its high water mark." General Lee rode out to meet the survivors, taking personal responsibility for the failure. "It is all my fault," he told them. "It is I who have lost this fight." His words, recorded by multiple witnesses, revealed his understanding of the day's significance. As evening approached, a great thunderstorm broke over the battlefield, the rain mingling with blood on the trampled earth. Under cover of darkness and storm, Lee ordered his wagon trains of wounded to begin the long retreat back to Virginia. The casualty figures were staggering. Of approximately 12,000 Confederates who made the charge, over half became casualties. Pickett's division alone lost nearly two-thirds of its strength. When asked afterward to reform his division, Pickett reportedly replied, "General Lee, I have no division." From the Union perspective, the victory was equally costly. Though they had held their ground, nearly 23,000 Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, roughly a quarter of Meade's army. The population of Gettysburg, normally about 2,500 citizens, now found themselves caring for over 20,000 wounded from both armies. That night, as the rain fell on friend and foe alike, America itself had been transformed. Though none could know it then, the tide of war had turned irreversibly against the Confederacy. The morning of July 4, 1863, the 87th anniversary of American independence, dawned with a solemn quiet over Gettysburg. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had begun its retreat during the night, leaving behind thousands of their wounded who could not be transported. The scene that greeted the sunrise was one of apocalyptic devastation. Every farm field, orchard, and woodland that had witnessed fighting was covered with the dead and dying. Bodies lay bloated in the summer heat, while the wounded moaned from makeshift hospitals established in homes, churches, and barns throughout the area. "In all my years as a surgeon, I have never witnessed suffering on such a scale," wrote Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, in his official report. "The town of Gettysburg has become one vast hospital, with the wounded outnumbering the living residents by nearly 10 to 1. General George Meade, though urged by President Lincoln to pursue the retreating Confederates and potentially end the war, moved cautiously. His army had suffered over 23,000 casualties, nearly a quarter of his effective force. Exhausted troops needed rest and reorganization before any effective pursuit could be mounted. Meanwhile, the civilians of Gettysburg faced a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. Elizabeth Thorne, 6 months pregnant and responsible for the local cemetery after her husband went to war, later recalled digging graves until her hands blistered and bled. "The stench was unbearable," she wrote in her diary, now preserved at the Adams County Historical Society. "We worked with kerchiefs soaked in vinegar tied over our faces, but still the odor of death penetrated everything. The countryside itself bore visceral scars. Trees stood stripped of leaves and branches by artillery fire, their trunks pockmarked with bullets. Stone walls were toppled, crops trampled, and farm buildings burned. Dead horses by the thousands lay scattered across the landscape, their bloated carcasses requiring urgent disposal to prevent disease. Rain continued intermittently throughout the day, turning the trampled earth to mud and washing rivers of blood into the local streams. Farmers reported finding their wells contaminated, while many would later discover unexploded shells buried in their fields, deadly reminders that would occasionally claim lives for decades afterward. The work of identifying the dead proved nearly impossible in many cases. Soldiers were buried where they fell, often in mass graves marked with crude wooden headboards, if marked at all. Many Confederate dead were simply covered with thin layers of soil, only to be exposed again by subsequent rains. The retreat of Lee's army toward the Potomac River became an ordeal of its own. A massive wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles, jolting along in agony over rough roads. When the army reached the Potomac, they found the river swollen by rains and impassable. For several days, the entire Confederate force was trapped with its back to the river, vulnerable to attack. By July 14th, however, the waters had receded enough to allow a crossing, and Lee's army escaped back to Virginia. The opportunity to destroy the Confederate army and potentially end the war had slipped away, much to Lincoln's dismay. In a letter to General Halleck, Lincoln wrote, "We had them within our grasp. We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours. And nothing I could say or do could make the army move." As summer turned to fall, the enormity of Gettysburg's significance began to register in the national consciousness. when Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin authorized the creation of a national cemetery for the Union dead at Gettysburg, President Lincoln was invited to deliver a few appropriate remarks at its dedication in November. The New York Times reported that Lincoln's invitation came almost as an afterthought. The main speaker would be the renowned orator Edward Everett, expected to deliver a 2-hour classical oration befitting the solemn occasion. On November 19, 1863, before a crowd of approximately 15,000, Everett spoke for 2 hours as expected, delivering an eloquent and comprehensive account of the battle. When he finished, Lincoln rose and delivered in just over 2 minutes what would become recognized as perhaps the greatest speech in American history. 77 years ago, he began, deliberately measuring time in the archaic biblical manner to invoke solemnity. Lincoln's brief address reframed the entire war, transforming it from a constitutional conflict over states' rights to a spiritual test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. In his closing lines, Lincoln laid out a mission that would guide the nation through the remainder of the war and beyond. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address, initially receiving mixed reviews in a nation still divided by war, would eventually be recognized as the definitive statement of American national purpose, a promise that the sacrifices at Gettysburg would lead to a more perfect union founded on the principle of human equality. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and witnesses to the Battle of Gettysburg gradually passed from the scene, the significance of those 3 July days in 1863 only grew in American consciousness. What began as a military engagement evolved into something far more profound, a touchstone for the American identity itself. Veterans of both armies began returning to the battlefield as early as 1868, initially with separate commemorations reflecting the still raw divisions of the conflict. A powerful moment came in 1887, at the battle's 24th anniversary, when survivors of the Philadelphia Brigade and Pickett's Division met at the stone wall where they had once tried to kill each other. In a gesture heavy with symbolism, the Confederate veterans crossed the wall peacefully this time, and the former enemies embraced on the spot where so many had fallen. Not a dry eye could be found among these grizzled veterans, reported the Philadelphia Inquirer, as ancient foes clasped hands across the wall that had once divided them in the fury of battle. By the 50th anniversary in 1913, over 53,000 aging veterans from both sides gathered at Gettysburg for what was called the Great Reunion. These old soldiers, now in their 70s and 80s, camped together on the battlefield, sharing meals and memories. President Woodrow Wilson addressed them, declaring, "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten." This sentiment, while powerful, masked a more complex reality. The quarrel over racial equality that had fundamentally driven the conflict remained far from resolved. The reconciliation celebrated at these reunions came at a cost, specifically the abandonment of the war's emancipationist legacy and the rights of Black Americans that Lincoln had linked to the sacrifices at Gettysburg. As historian David Blight notes in Race and Reunion, the sectional reunion after so bloody a civil war was a political triumph by the beginning of the 20th century, but it had been achieved by pushing race and the memory of emancipation to the margins of national consciousness. According to records preserved at the Gettysburg National Military Park, not a single Black veteran was invited to the Great Reunion of 1913, despite the service of nearly 200,000 Black soldiers in the Union Army during the war. The physical preservation of the battlefield itself became a national priority. In 1895, Gettysburg became one of America's first national military parks. Iron markers and stone monuments began to dot the landscape, creating what historian Thomas Desjardins calls one of the largest collections of outdoor sculpture in the world. Each monument tells a story, not just of the battle, but of how later generations chose to remember it. The State of Virginia's monument, featuring Robert E. Lee on his horse traveler gazing across the field of Pickett's charge, was not erected until 1917, amid the lost cause narrative that romanticized the Confederate cause while minimizing the centrality of slavery to the conflict. Through the 20th century, Gettysburg remained a place of pilgrimage for Americans seeking connection with their past. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, exactly 100 years after the battle, Martin Luther King Jr. deliberately echoed Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in his "I Have a Dream" speech, implicitly arguing that the new birth of freedom Lincoln had promised remained unfulfilled for Black Americans. In 2008, when Barack Obama became the first Black president of the United States, he chose to take the oath of office on the same Bible Lincoln had used at his first inauguration, symbolically linking his historic presidency to the legacy of Gettysburg and emancipation. Today, over 1 million visitors walk the grounds of Gettysburg annually. They follow the path of Pickett's charge, climb Little Round Top, and stand in the angle where the fate of the nation was decided in minutes of desperate hand-to-hand combat. They come seeking different things. Military enthusiasts study tactics, genealogists search for ancestors' regiments, and ordinary Americans try to connect with a pivotal moment in their national story. Historian James McPherson, writing in the Journal of American History, observed, "Gettysburg resonates in American culture because it represents both our greatest tragedy and our greatest triumph, the tragedy of civil war and the triumph of national survival." The battle that raged for 3 days in July 1863 was indeed more than a military engagement. It was a crucible that tested and redefined American identity. When Lincoln suggested that the world would little note nor long remember what was said at Gettysburg, he was profoundly mistaken. Both the battle and his words about its meaning have become central to how Americans understand their nation. On the grounds of Gettysburg today, visitors can still walk across the fields where history pivoted. They can stand where Lincoln delivered his immortal address. And if they listen carefully in the quiet evenings, when the tour buses have departed and the summer insects begin their chorus, they might sense the presence of those thousands who, as Lincoln put it, gave the last full measure of devotion that the experiment in liberty and self-government might endure. In the words carved into the memorial at Gettysburg's National Cemetery, "The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract." This hallowed ground continues to speak to each generation of Americans, challenging them to live up to the ideals for which so many fought and died on those 3 fateful days in 1863.